I have a habit of putting my glasses down and then having no idea where I left them. This morning I found them in the fridge when I went to put back the block of cheese that I had taken out to snack on during the night. I also realized that I had odd socks on, and they were not just mismatched, one of them was inside out. If I was 30 years old, this would be called being absent-minded. But I am brushing 80, so other names might be used for my confused moments. Medical, ominous-sounding terms. But I would rather laugh about my socks and my glasses than dwell on these. As well as keeping my sense of humor intact, I think that it's important to keep busy at my age. I like to keep my home clean and tidy. I also like to listen to classical music and follow the news and current affairs on the radio. And now that I have my glasses and they've warmed up back to room temperature after their spell in the fridge, I have decided to make this record of these strange things that happened to me many years ago. My memories of this time are as sharp as a blade. I started work at the railway station in January 1959. I was employed as a security guard on the night shift. The station was in the southwest of England, in the heart of a city, and thousands of people passed through it every day. I had read up on the station and the public library before I started my new job, and knew that it had been built in the 1890s. It was a vast space with guts of stone where the winter daylight streamed in between the steel ribs of the glass roof, and the sounds of conversations, footsteps, announcements, engines and wheels on the track mingled and echoed. As day passed into night, the station became a different place. The crowds diminished, the shadows grew. That first January, it was bitterly cold, and the uniform that I had been provided with felt far too thin as I set off on my nightly patrol. It was a Monday night, and the final train of the day was due in at 11 p.m. on Platform 1, so I started there. The train pulled in as I reached the platform. It connected with a ferry service from Northern Europe, which docked on the East Coast, and this was the final stop of a long journey. The handful of passengers who had traveled all the way to the end of the route disembarked. Their hands were buried in their pockets as they walked away, shivering in the cold. None of them gave me a second look. I might as well have been one of the luggage trolleys which were huddled together near the platform until they were needed again the next day. I watched the passengers leave and then carried on with my patrol. There would be no more commuter trains until 6 a.m., so the station could be locked up for the night. I did a circuit to check that there were no members of the public left in the station. A couple of times so far that month, I had had to wake up a drunk who had fallen asleep on a bench and see them on their way. But most nights, there were no stragglers, and there were none on that night, so I went to the first of the two large entrances to the station and pulled down and locked its shutter. I gave the shutter a rattle for good luck and then headed to the other entrance, where I stood and waited until my watch showed that it was 10 minutes to midnight. The policeman on foot patrol was as punctual as the trains back in them days, and he strolled into view right on time. We chatted for a couple of minutes and then he continued on his way, satisfied that everything was in order. And then I pulled the other shutter down and locked it. The station was now closed to members of the public and I was alone. Apart from a restless bird or two clattering around in the eaves above, all was quiet, until the sound of the first freight train of the night filled the station. The engine had already slipped out of view by the time that I looked around, but carriage after carriage sped through my line of vision, and then it was gone. A half dozen or so of these industrial workhorses would pass through the station over the course of the night. They never stopped at the station. They were other people's responsibilities, and that was fine by me. I could concentrate on getting warm. The security guard's office was a glorified cupboard close to the ticket office. I hurried inside and stood in front of the coal fire, rubbing my hands together. My fingers tingled with sharp pains as the feeling came back into them, and then I added another piece of coal to the fire and moved closer to it, until it felt like the skin on my face was about to singe, and I had to step back. The thought of staying in that cozy space all night was tempting, but I was young and conscientious. I wanted to do a good job and earn my weekly wage. I also knew my predecessor had been fired after being found asleep in front of the fire by the station master when he had arrived early to begin his shift. Something that I had been told no doubt as a warning to keep me on my toes. Not that I could feel my toes due to the freezing temperature of the station on those winter nights, as I left the comfort of the security guard's office to continue my patrol. The lost property office was the first stop. I double-checked its door was firmly locked and then shone the beam of my torch through its window. The desk was empty and I could see storage boxes piled high up behind it. In the rush of the day, a steady stream of bags, umbrellas, and gloves were mislaid. Some things would never be reclaimed and, after gathering dust, would eventually be sold off or thrown away. I would be told things which had been deliberately abandoned had found their way to the lost property office as well. There had been a revolver which had been used in a murder and locked in an anonymous-looking box before the killer left it on a train, where the guard found it and handed it in, oblivious to the gruesome trail. There was also a severed hand in a suitcase, which had been discovered when the smell of decomposing flesh had started to drift out. I thought the story of the revolver might be true. I was convinced the severed hand incident was made up to joke with the new boy, which I was at the time. I smiled to myself, lowered the torch and walked on past the waiting rooms, where the passengers could sit in the day huddled behind newspapers and magazines before catching their trains. Then there was the cafe, with its selection of cakes, sandwiches, tea, and coffee. There was nothing left out overnight, but imagining the food made my stomach rumble, a sound that was amplified by the deserted station. Well, almost deserted. There were the birds nesting in the rafters that I had heard earlier, and I had seen a couple of rats scurrying across the station floor on previous shifts. And as I turned to begin a new leg of my circuit, I noticed movement on one of the tracks. I lifted my torch. The track ran into a tunnel and framed onto the tunnel's arch, a fox was staring back at me. Its eyes blazed with fierce life in the beam, and then it turned slowly away and trotted into the tunnel. I watched it go, feeling like I was the interloper. After this, the rest of the night passed slow and cold until another shift over. I was yawning as I left the station. Dawn was still a couple of hours away and my breath frosted in the darkness as I set off on the walk home. Tuesday's night shift seemed to come around far too soon. I hadn't yet settled into sleeping well during the day, so I was yawning once more as I headed for the security guard's office and signed in. The last train was due in, so I set off as usual towards platform 1. I hadn't got very far though when I noticed a man sitting on one of the benches. He was drinking from a bottle. From the way that he swayed from side to side, it wasn't his first sip of the night. I sighed and went over to tell him that he couldn't do that here. As I got closer, I saw that he wore a smart pinstriped suit and tie under his coat. I wondered if maybe he had lost his job and was drowning his sorrows, or maybe if the pressure of his job had driven him to drink. Keeping my voice reasonable but firm, I asked him to leave. He gazed up at me blearily, mumbled something about the management that was peppered with obscenities, and dragged himself to his feet. I felt sorry for him as I watched him weave his way towards the door, but I had done my job, and I could hear the final train was arriving over at platform 1. I headed that way and found myself being passed on either side by the commuters who had been on the train leaving the station. By the time that I got to the platform, the driver and the guard had finished for the day as well, and followed the weary travelers out. There was one person left on the platform though. A young woman. She was dressed smartly in a warm coat and was glancing around as if she was looking for someone. The last train was empty and locked up, so if she had been expecting to meet one of its passengers, then she would be disappointed, I knew. And though she was very different to the drunk, she could not stay in the station either. "Excuse me," I said in a gentle voice. "There will be no more trains today. I'm sorry, but I need to ask you to leave." She looked at me, seeming startled, as if she had just realized that I was there. She looked on the verge of tears. "No," she said. "Andrew promised me he would come back in time for my birthday, and it's my birthday today. He has to be here, he has to." I had no idea what to say. Whoever this Andrew was, his promise was not going to be kept, and she had to leave now. I couldn't just throw her out though. I was trying to think what to do when I heard the sound of glass breaking. I turned. The drunk was still in the station and swaying worse than ever, and his bottle was in pieces on the ground. I needed to go deal with him and then sweep the broken glass up. I sighed and turned back to the young woman to ask her again to leave, but she wasn't there. I scanned the platform, but there was no sign of her anywhere. I figured she must have given up waiting and decided to leave, and then I put her out of my mind. I had a drunk to deal with. He was swearing loudly now as well. I strode over there to tell him to get lost. After more swearing and fist waving, he staggered off. I was standing there shaking my head when the policeman came into view. He smiled when I explained what had happened and told me to not worry about it. I wouldn't be the one waking up with a hangover. And we chatted for a bit longer and then he headed off, leaving me to do my final checks, lock the station up for the night and go get warm. The first freight train of the night rumbled past and I headed for the office and its welcoming fire with a smile on my face. A smile that did not last. There was someone still in the station. They were standing near platform 1, a lonely figure shrouded in the gloom. I turned the torch in their direction and saw that it was the young woman that I had spoken to earlier. She was looking out at the empty platform and her shoulders were shaking as she sobbed uncontrollably. Muttering under my breath, not understanding how I had missed her, I strode over to her. I must admit, my frustration got the better of me and there wasn't a trace of sympathy in my voice when I said firmly, "You can't be here. The man you're waiting for isn't here, and he isn't going to be coming here tonight." Her body grew still at my cold words. She turned slowly and looked at me. Her face was pale and streaked with tears and her eyes bloodshot. "Abandoned," she whispered. "He's abandoned me." As she spoke, her skin seemed to grow paler. I thought that I could see the dark lines of her veins beneath and then the outline of her bones, the line of her jaw, her cheeks. And her eyes were now becoming dark openings, the flesh of them fading as I stared in mounting horror. She spoke again, her words seeping from a lipless mouth. "He abandoned me, my love." She was no longer a woman now, no longer human. She was a thing of bone, a hideous skeletal apparition. And then the bones themselves started to fade. There was empty air where the finger bones had been, nothingness in the place of the ribs. The skull was lost into the darkness of the night. The only thing that was left was a small voice whispering, "Abandoned, abandoned." And then there was silence. I was alone. I walked unsteadily back to the security guard's office and closed the door. I built the fire up and stood inches from it, but I just couldn't get warm. I felt chilled through the marrow of my bones. The winter nights that followed were long and lonely. I was on edge, waiting for that thing to re-emerge from the darkness. But as spring turned into summer and the nights grew warmer and nothing strange occurred, I started to relax again. In early August, I was watching the passengers leave the final train when the guard waved me over. He was standing in a doorway towards the back of the train. I strolled over as he dragged a wooden box out of the train and onto the platform. It was narrow and about 4 feet long. One of the passengers left this in the luggage compartment, he told me. It can't stay on the train, so you'll need to take it. And then he disappeared back into the train, leaving me to deal with the box. I had the key to the lost property office on my chain, so I decided the best thing to do was take the box there. It would be someone else's responsibility in the morning then. There were no handles, so I bent my knees and lifted one end to test how heavy it was. Thankfully, it was light enough for me to drag it across the concourse to the lost property office without too much effort. I let myself in and I left it by the desk. Job done, I thought, and I locked the door behind me. The rest of the shift dragged along in its usual way, and I was on my last circuit of the station before the station master was due. I wandered past the lost property office and glanced inside at the box. How could anyone leave that on a train was a mystery to me, but it wasn't my problem. I carried on my way and then stopped. I had heard a tapping sound. In the empty chamber that the station became at night, it had been clear, and it had come from inside the lost property office. I backtracked and peered through the window. I couldn't see anything wrong and was starting to wonder if it had been my imagination when the tapping had returned. It was coming from the box. My nerves began to tingle as the tapping grew louder. There was something in the box, and whatever it was restless. I took a deep breath, found the key, opened it up, and went into the lost property office to see what it was. Though dawn was close, it was still gloomy in the lost property office. I clicked on my torch, turned the beam onto the box, and reached down to see if I could open it. The top had a latch on it. I pushed the latch back and started to lift the lid. It creaked, and the tapping stopped. I paused. My heart was still beating quick and my mouth was dry. Gut instinct was telling me to close the lid and walk away, but it was too late. I could see movement through the small gap that I had made. Something was twisting and scraping, and reaching up. I watched in mounting horror as the top was pushed aside. The thing looking up at me with dark, questioning eyes was an aberration. Its pale, hairless skin was cracked and shriveled. Its hideously emaciated flesh clung to protruding bones. It might once have been the height of a grown man, but its damaged, grotesque body looked so diminished that it could fit into the constricted space of the box. I wanted to run and keep running until I escaped this waking nightmare, but all the strength had been stolen from my limbs. I could feel sweat trickle ice cold down my face, but I could not wipe it away. I could barely breathe, as the thing shifted and writhed inside its box and stared at me. As its mouth opened and a hoarse whisper escaped. "You," it said. "You are not the one I paid to help me escape the mob and bring me to my new lair." Each word seemed to cause it pain, and a shudder passed through its body before it gasped. "Betrayed. He has betrayed me and given me over to a stranger." And then it rose. It sat and looked around at its surroundings. "Given me to a stranger and left me in a strange place," it said. "No matter, I will survive. I will hunt again and I will feed." As it hissed this last word, its dreadful gaze locked onto me once again. Its lips parted. Its razor-sharp smile was revealed. Adrenaline flooded through my body at the sight of this, and I managed to break free from the paralysis which had held me in place. I staggered backwards away from the creature, which was crawling from the box, moving on all fours, its back arched, its fangs exposed. I crashed out of the door back onto the concourse. High above, the birds cried out, as if they could sense the evil that had emerged into the station, that was dragging its foul, wasted form out of the lost property office, and getting closer and closer. There was no way that I could escape. I was helpless. I was going to die gripped between its jaws, which were extending as I stared in terror at the creature. Once it held me, it would bite down and down until my blood ran a rich, obscene feast. I could only hope that I would pass out quick as my life was stolen from me. The burst of strength the adrenaline had given me was spent. I fell to my knees and I began to weep. The creature moved closer still. I could feel its fetid breath against my skin. I could see the desire in its dark eyes. Only then was that a moment of confusion that I saw, a flicker of fear. It was no longer looking at me. Its gaze was turning towards the roof, where the first light of dawn was reaching down through the glass to touch its skin. A wisp of smoke rose from its back, from its neck. It hissed and began to claw at its skin, but the smoke was spreading over its arms and legs. Its face was the first one to burst into flames, dark tongues of fire which danced and spat sparks out. The creature began to scream as the flames traveled across its monstrous body, consuming it. Sprawled out on the ground, I watched as the flames stripped away skin and flesh and bone, until there was nothing left that I could see. If there was ash, it was too fine for my eyes to make out. I slumped forwards and put my head in my hands. The creature had been destroyed. In the wake of this nerve-shredding encounter, the quiet routines of the night shift once more settled back into place. September was not memorable. October was dull, and I was mighty glad of this. And then November came. It was the first Friday of the month. I walked to work in the darkness under storm clouds that threatened but did not break. The street outside was quiet. There were a few passers-by and a man laying out pieces of cardboard on the pavement near one of the entrances. I had seen him every night for a week as I had arrived for my shift. When I locked up later, he was still there, huddled inside the shelter that he had made of cardboard and asleep. I had asked the policeman about the man. He had shrugged and said that there was nothing to be done unless the man was causing a nuisance. So I ignored the person sleeping outside the station and I got on with my job. That night was no different. I secured the shutters and walked the route that I always did, with welcome breaks in front of the coal fire. Shut away inside the station, it was easy to forget about the world outside, even the storm clouds, until I heard the sound of rain landing on the glass roof. It was gentle at first, a patter, but then the rain began to fall heavier and heavier. The storm had finally broken. The sound of the rain striking the glass grew. It filled the station, an assault of noise. The roof kept the rain at bay though. I was dry and safe. Unlike anyone who was caught out in the rain, I thought, they would be soaked to the skin and cold and helpless, and their shelter of cardboard would be destroyed. I frowned. I told myself that the man outside the station was not my problem, that I couldn't break the rules for him. But all around me, the tumultuous sound of the rain continued to grow more violent. I swore to myself as I made a decision. I couldn't leave him out there. I went over to the entrance near where he had been sleeping, unlocked the shutter and pulled it halfway up, just enough for me to lean out. Freezing cold rain struck me, making me screw up my eyes as I tried to see if the man was still there. He was, curled up into a ball and pressed back tight against the outer wall of the station, trying to protect himself from the cloudburst. "Hey," I called out, "in here." I wasn't sure that he could hear me over the sound of the rain, but then he looked up at me. I waved an arm, telling him to come inside. He half crawled, half stumbled towards me and under the shutter. Almost blinded now by the rain, I pulled the shutter down, locked it, and then gasped in relief. Even though I had not been exposed to the full force of the rain, I was wet through. The rain had gone through my uniform and into my boots. That was nothing, I thought, compared to the man who had made it inside. He lay on his side shaking with what I assumed was as much shock as cold. His skin, where I could see it under these sodden rags he wore, was drained of all color. I knew that he needed to get warm as soon as possible. "There's a fire," I told him, "in my office." He mumbled something and tried to move his head, but he did not even seem capable of getting to his feet. Not unless I helped him. I grabbed an arm and, muttering encouragement, got him up off the floor. He would have been too heavy for me to carry even if he had not been made heavier by the rain in his clothes, but I could prop him up and lead him as he managed to walk. It felt like it took an age, but finally we reached the office and the fire. Using one hand, I moved a chair closer to the fire and then maneuvered him into the chair. I added more coal to the fire and then stood back, panting with the effort. The floor around the chair where he sat was already covered in a pool of water which had dripped off the man, and his head hung down over his chest. But I could see a little bit of color coming back into his cheeks. He coughed and rubbed his face, and then looked up at me, smiled weakly and said, "Thank you. I think you saved my life." I grinned, feeling cold and wet but good about myself. I figured I would leave the man to dry off and get some rest, and then he could leave in a few hours. The station master would never know that I had broken the rules, and everything would be fine. I shook myself to try and get a bit more rain off myself and then went to continue my patrol. It was time to get back to the routine. The sound of the rain had been lessened somewhat inside the office, but back out in the concourse it was just as loud. Surely it had to end soon, I thought as I squelched my way past the lost property office in the cafe, and on, round the platforms. The rain continued undiminished though. I began to wonder if the roof would start to leak or if the storm would cause other problems. I wasn't a religious person, but my parents had taken me to services when I was a child, and one of the stories I had heard about a great flood came back to me as I looked around the station. And then I noticed movement in a tunnel and directed my torch beam that way. I saw a fox trotting out. It carried a cub in its mouth. The cub wriggled but looked healthy enough, and I wondered where the fox was taking it. With a nimble grace, the fox jumped up onto the platform and placed the cub down, and then it descended back onto the tracks and ran into the tunnel, to return a couple of minutes later with another cub. The second cub deposited on the platform. The fox encouraged both its young to walk across the station. Watching them slip away into the darkness as the rain beat down viciously, my imagination flared. I started to feel even colder. Thoughts of floods, of apocalypses filled my mind. I looked back at the tunnel. There was something else moving in there. I shone the torch beam back towards the tunnel but could not make out what I had seen. I moved closer and I peered down the tracks. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There were dozens of rats scurrying out of the tunnel and along the tracks. They were gathered together in a tight, fast-moving line of gray bodies that seemed to sparkle in places as my torch reflected off their eyes. The line grew as more and more rats appeared, all rushing forward. Soon there were hundreds, and I could no longer see the tracks under the mass of rats. I could, though, see water beginning to rush through in the wake of the rats, a filthy tide which began to engulf the first of the rats that were in its path. The other rats must have understood what was happening, as they had known to flee in the first place, because they started to climb up the sides and onto the platform, close to where I stood. Too close. I began to back away. Behind them, the flood was rising. The bodies of rats were being swept along, but there were so many more that had escaped. Hundreds felt like it had become thousands as the rats ran towards me. I turned to sprint away, but as I did, my ankle twisted and I fell. I threw my hands out to break my fall, and a second later I was down and the rats were on me. I could feel their claws scraping at my skin. I saw tails flickering as they ran across my face. I wanted to cry out in fear but clamped my teeth shut to try and keep them out of my mouth. I lashed out with my hands to try to get them off me, but there were too many, and they were starting to bite, piercing my skin. I felt blood running down my face. The rats bit and tore and I lost any semblance of control. I began to scream at them to stop. Needle-sharp teeth cut into my lips and tongue. I screamed on, crazed and terrified at the heart of the maelstrom of blood-crazed rats. Everything started to go dark and then I felt like I was moving, falling into oblivion, I thought. A merciful release from the darkness that had descended on me. But I realized that I was not falling. I was moving at speed along the ground. It felt like I was being dragged by my collar. I managed to open my eyes. There were still rats on me, but I could see the roof through gaps in their flailing bodies. And then the roof disappeared and it was replaced by a small ceiling. There was a fire burning and I was back in the office, and a hand was pulling rats from me and throwing them away. One tried to leap back onto me but was met by the sole of a boot. It crashed backwards and then scurried away, through a door that was slammed shut. I looked up and saw a bedraggled face grinning back at me. Just a few more of the devils to get off you," the man that I had helped out of the storm said and plucked another rat off me. I lay there for a while after this, trying to catch my breath. It felt like every part of me hurt. My uniform was almost torn to shreds as well thanks to the rats. I was looking at it, wondering feverishly how I would explain the state of my uniform to the station master, and if I would have to pay for the damage, when the man smiled again and said, "You look worse than me." I looked at his ragged jacket and trousers and I burst out laughing. I kept laughing uncontrollably for a long time. Still feeling shaky but back in control of my emotions, I got to my feet and went out to see what state that the station was in. To my relief, the rain had stopped and the plague of rats had gone. The tracks where they had flooded were still slick with rain and the corpses of drowned rats. I became aware the man was standing next to me, looking down onto the tracks as well. Even though my hand was stinging with pain, I held it out to shake. "Thank you," I said, my voice breaking. At the end of my shift, I was sent to the hospital to have my wounds patched up. If I didn't work, I didn't get paid, so I went in as usual the next night. The station had been cleared of any signs of the flood. It looked in a lot better shape than me as I dragged my injured body through another shift. Christmas arrived soon enough after this and was notable only for an increase in the number of sleepy drunks that I needed to escort out of the station before I locked up. The new year and the weeks that followed passed sedately enough, and before I knew it, it was almost spring. One night it was around 3 a.m. and I was patrolling when a freight train swept into view. The engine rushed past and the carriages clattered along. I had seen hundreds of freight trains over the time that I had worked at the station, and in their own way, they had become a part of the background. And I thought that this one was just the same. It was another freight train on its way to a destination that I would never know, until I heard the high-pitched sound coming from its wheels. It was a sudden screeching noise, and then seconds later, chaos broke out. The screeching became a metallic scream and one of the carriages came off the tracks. It tilted and rolled, still traveling at speed. I stood there, transfixed as the carriage twisted and crashed and finally ground to a halt. Even though the cab was a long way ahead and out of sight to me, I imagined the driver of the freight train would have known something serious had happened. They must, I figured, have slammed the brakes on and should be able to alert the authorities. Left alone in the immediate aftermath of the accident, I surveyed the damage. I had no idea what the carriage was carrying and nothing had spelled out. There were no windows, and there never were, but there was a single metal door in the side. I didn't think there would be anybody inside, but I didn't want to risk even a single life on an assumption, and decided to try and check inside the carriage before phoning for help myself. This mess would need clearing in the next few hours or else the commuter trains would not run on time. Thinking this, I pulled on the door. It was buckled and stuck firm despite me putting all my strength into my efforts. I cursed and was about to give up trying altogether and go summon help when I thought that I heard movement inside the carriage. Shuffling and scraping sounds. "Hey," I cried out. "Is there someone in there?" I put my ear against the door to try and hear better, but there was no reply. There was definitely something inside though. I knew that sometimes the freight trains carried livestock and wondered if it was cattle that I could hear, but I wasn't sure. I hammered on the door with my fist. "Hey," I tried again. "Hey." But mine was still the only voice. I tried one last pull on the door and this time it moved. Just a couple of inches and then nothing more. I peered through the crack to try and see, and I could make out dark shapes writhing inside. Whether it was a man or beast, I did not know. I raised my torch and shone it through the gap. It illuminated a pair of eyes, human eyes, and then I saw hands reaching out towards my light, bodies moving. I swore in shock. There were people in there. I redoubled my efforts to open the door. The people trapped inside must have understood someone was trying to free them, and I heard hands slamming against the other side of the door. The fingers appeared in the gap as well, gripping the edge of the metal. I struggled on and the sounds inside grew more frantic. The banging sound spread the length of the carriage. My mind raced as I realized that there must be dozens of people crammed in there. I didn't have time to wonder why. I had to get them out. But no matter how hard I tried, the door would not move any further. "Listen," I called out. "I'll go and phone the police. They'll know what to do." I waited for a moment for an acknowledgement from inside that I had been understood. I didn't want them to think that I was abandoning them to their terrifying fate. But no one said anything. No one had spoken at all, in fact, which was strange. Even if they hadn't understood English, surely I would have heard voices. I stood there for a moment perplexed. And then I told myself that I needed to get a move on because these sounds of metal being struck were getting louder and louder. And now the carriage was shaking under the attack. The door was shaking violently as well. And then it cracked open, and they began to clamber out. In the gloom, they looked like ordinary men, but as they staggered into the open, I had the terrifying feeling that something was very wrong. It was the way that they were moving, slowly, seeming unsteady on their feet, the way they swayed, their arms held up in front of them, and drifting towards me, the guttural groan which came from their lips. I had to see clearly, I had to understand. I lifted the torch and pointed the beam into their midst. Fear slammed into me. Their faces shone with rage, with primal anger. Drool hung from their chins. Their skin was gray and rotted away in places to reveal the flesh beneath. Their clothes were torn and soiled. I gagged as the stench of them reached me. They had been men once like me, but now they were what remains when the humanity has been stripped away. This is what I believed as they shuffled towards me. I realized their eyes were being drawn to the torch beam and I threw it away from me. The torch clattered to the ground and their heads turned at the sound. They paused. If the flesh of their minds was as ravaged as their skin, they had stopped for a moment because they were trying to understand what they had heard, which meant that I had a few seconds grace, a few moments to try and escape. I span around. I was dizzy, nauseous, and on the tipping point between sanity and mindless terror. But somehow I managed to put one foot in front of the other, almost tripping over myself, but I did it. I ran, wanting only to get away and not daring to look back. I imagined them instead shuffling forwards, their dark eyes all locked onto me, and the little strength that I had in my legs drained away. I stumbled, almost fell, but managed to regain my balance and careened on. I could hear them groaning behind me like the rumble of a distant storm. I was gasping desperately, trying to get air into my lungs. My chest burned, my vision blurred with sweat and tears. I staggered on. The hideous groans grew louder, the storm came closer. I looked around, desperately searching for somewhere to hide. The cafe was the closest. I had to go for it. I sprinted to the door, scrambled to get the keys out of my pocket, almost dropping them, and then struggled to get the key to the cafe door into the lock. Finally it went in and the lock turned. I hurried into the cramped space, locked the door behind me, and then crouched on the ground. And I thought, maybe they did not know that I had come into the cafe. Maybe they would walk right past me. These were the slenderest of odds, but it was all that I had. Clinging on to the faint hope, I tried to make myself as small as possible and as quiet as I could. I breathed in, clamped my mouth shut. My heartbeat pulsed in my ears. The pressure was building inside me to breathe out. It was agonizing. And it might have all been in vain if they had seen where I had gone or heard my clumsy struggles with the key. I finally had to release the breath and began to steal regular, shallow breaths. And then I chanced to glance up. I could just about see out of the cafe's window, but there was nothing visible there, just the darkness. I listened, and there they were, just outside, groaning and shuffling, moving past the window now. I could see them, and I could make out their ragged shapes, a nightmare procession. I closed my eyes. I couldn't look anymore. If I can't see them, they can't see me. I told myself this silently, feeling like a child who knows that there's a monster waiting in the room, and the only way to survive is to hide under the covers with your eyes closed until dawn. I told myself again, moving my mouth but not speaking. If I can't see them, they can't see me. If I can't see them, they can't see me. There was, though, no escaping that terrible sound emanating from their throats. The groan, the rumble, on and on. They were a few feet away, on the other side of a brick wall, a pane of glass, a door. Such flimsy things. I hugged my knees to my chest and began to rock back and forwards. I thought about the people that I loved, about all the things that I wanted to do with my life. I would never see my parents again, my fiancé. I would never go to New York and peer up at a skyscraper. I would never hold my child in my arms. All of those things would be as nothing if they discovered me in my hiding place. I managed to still myself, sat unmoving and waited for fate to decide what to do with me. Time passed. In reality, it was likely only a minute or two, but time was slowed so much that it felt like an age, and I thought the sound of the groaning was a little fainter. I concentrated, trying to shut out my fears and focus only on the sound of them. Yes, I was sure of it. They were moving away from my hiding place. I wiped away the fat beads of sweat that were running down my face and grinned maniacally. Now I just needed to make it to one of the entrances, open the shutter and make good my escape. Which one though? To try and see which way was the best, I stood to get a better view out of the window. I couldn't see a thing. I moved my face closer to the glass, but it still was nothing. I exhaled in frustration. My breath misted the pain, and a hand slammed against the glass. A face peered in at me. The flesh around its bloodshot eyes had rotted away, and where its nose should have been, there was a dark cavity. The stump of a tongue flickered inside its mouth, as it looked like it was trying to speak. But all I heard was an inhuman groan. I flinched and I moved away from the window, but too late, far too late. I could see more of them approaching the window, crowding around their grotesque kin. Spittle from their open mouths smeared the glass and more hands reached out, striking the glass. I knew that it would give under the force of the blow soon, and that I had nowhere to go, no escape. I backed against a far wall and stared death in the face. Hands slammed and slammed against the window, and I saw rather than heard the first crack appear. It was a slim fissure that spread, and then fragments of glass began to shower down, and a hand broke through, reaching in up to the elbow. Fingers grasped at the air, reaching out for me. I could only watch, transfixed, as more of the window broke and the first of them stepped into the cafe. Broken glass decorated its corrupted skin. Its head turned slowly, as if it was taking in the scene. The counter where commuters were served in the day, the till, the chalkboard where the prices were written out, and me, cowering and shaking. It took a step forward. Behind it, more bodies were breaking through. All of them were staring at me, all reaching out for me. Their teeth were exposed and drool was running down their chins. And a single word was being formed in their mouths. A repeated, distorted chant. "Flesh," they growled. "Flesh." A fresh wave of terror passed through me because I knew now that they wanted to devour me. I began to scream and still they groaned. "Flesh." There was another sound as well, distant shouting, but I did not know who from. I could not think. I was about to be overwhelmed. And then a sharp and sudden noise cut through all the rest. The things paused their attack on me. Their faces turned to look in the direction that the noise had come from. A second noise, louder, sharper, came as they did, and something struck the head of one of them. It toppled forward. A third and fourth noise filled the air and two more of them fell. The one nearest to me cried out in rage and turned back to me, its teeth about to bite. A new noise came, the retort of a shot. Red splattered out from the thing's head. It fell forwards onto me. My legs gave way and I collapsed with the thing lying over me. I now know that this saved my life. There was a flurry of more sharp, cracking noises and then silence. I lay there trying to breathe, my mind racing as I tried to understand what had happened. And then I heard voices, words being shouted. "All escape test subjects are neutralized," someone yelled. "Check them, make sure," another voice cried out, and moments later the body that covered me was dragged away, and I found myself looking up into the face of a young man. He was wearing a beret with a metal insignia on it and a khaki uniform. He frowned and then looked over his shoulder and shouted, "Sir, I've found a civilian, he's alive." I had survived. In the years that followed, I married and went on a honeymoon to New York, and I looked up in awe at the buildings which soared around me. 2 years after the wedding, our first child was born, and I held him in my arms and cried. I had a new job by then. I was working in an office, and when I passed through the railway station, I was just one more commuter on a busy, bright day. I looked around though as I waited for my train, and a shiver would pass through me as I remembered the terrors that the night had brought.